Hello, BookTube. This is going to be an inadvertent part two to an earlier video that I made as a kind of response to something that Ben Sanders was talking about on his channel about what makes a book good, what constitutes a good book, what are the elements involved. Uh, I made a monstrously long video on that, and it cut off in the middle, which I'm assuming was the work of God, wanting to spare you all. So I'm making the second half of that video now. I'll just redo it, and as usual, I wanted to shift the subject to nonfiction. Because as I noted in that earlier video, BookTube still has a knee-jerk tendency to equate book with fiction, with novel. And I'm here to tell you, there's lots of other reading out there. And I wanted to, in that earlier video, I mentioned that you're still governed by some very basic questions in terms of assessing a book that's in front of you, in terms of being able to put it on a graph of where it belongs. Who is it written for? Who is it written by? What is it written with? And how is it written? And if you do a little bit of diligence, I admit nonfiction needs more of it than fiction, although fiction needs more of it than fiction readers tend to think or give it. But if you do those things, it makes the process of selecting a new nonfiction book on some historical subject or whatever less intimidating, I think. And I wanted, in this second half, I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. And I will go to nonfiction genre that I love most of all, which is biography. And in this case, it'll be someone who's come up on this channel a couple of times, King Edward VII. He was the son and heir of Queen Victoria, and when she died, after having reigned longer than any English monarch in history up until that point, Queen Elizabeth II exceeded her just recently. But up until then, as in the case of Queen Elizabeth II, in fact more so because of mortality rates, when Queen Victoria finally died, you would have been hard-pressed to find someone in her realm that remembered a time when she wasn't on the throne, that remembered her wicked uncles. So Edward had been in the spotlight the whole time as Prince of Wales, as a gambling, indiscreet, gourmand, headline-grabbing Prince of Wales, who seemed fairly irresponsible, seemed not really aware of the gravity of the position that he was destined to take over. So when he did become king, his reign became a bit of a surprise for a lot of people, especially a lot of pundits, because he took the job very seriously. He called it a job and worked at it conscientiously, even when it seemed like he wasn't. And he gave his foreign office the fits, because he would often employ a kind of soft back-channel power, what we would call back-channel power, in terms of international relations with the monarchs of all the countries of Europe and Mediterranean, where most of whom were relatives of his or friends of his. And he would, the royal yacht would show up in their harbor, and he would be more than happy to join them for parties and balls and entertainments of what kind or another. And all the communications that would happen there were not necessarily approved by his State Department, but they could have international complications. They could have ramifications that only a king can have. And Edward understood that. And it turned out, by the time his brief, he only reigned for 10 years, at the beginning of the 20th century, and by the time his reign was over, even his harshest critics were willing to admit that regardless of whether or not they approved of the outcome, they were certainly wrong when they thought that he was a nincompoop who took the throne. He clearly understood what he was doing and tried hard to make the world a better place, a more stable place, by that back-channel diplomacy. So I have always found his reign utterly fascinating. And I have a shelf full of biographies of him. And when we finally have a Steve Con and you all come over here, I will show you that you will see that in my biography section, even now, after a lot of paring down, it's still possible to find multiple biographies of individuals And I've had guests come over and look at 10 biographies of Lord Byron or 10 biographies of Nathaniel Hawthorne and say, why on earth do you need that many? And the I know I don't bore them with the answer. I just say, have another calzone. But the answer to that question uh, bears exactly on what I'm talking about today in terms of what you're getting from each of those biographies. I admit, if you're going to read every biography of a certain historical figure, you're only going to do that if you're interested in them anyway. And you don't need to do that. I think it's a lot of fun to have certain subjects. It doesn't have to be a biography. I have many more books on World War II than I have on Edward VII. But it's nice to have a specialty where you know your way around, and therefore every new book on the subject is of inherent interest, even if you're going to disagree with it. That's nice. But I wanted to show you, with just a few of those Edward VII books, the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like, for instance, if we start off with this one, this is by Sir Sidney Lee, and this is volume 2 of his 2-volume biography of the king. This covers the reign, and the earlier volume covered his storied youth and all of his exploits and scandals and love affairs and whatnot. And if you read a little around the book, you will know what you're getting with this. Sir Sidney Lee was a professional editor and biographer. He was a professional man of letters, someone well accustomed to handling primary sources and estimating their relative value to each other and whatnot. Someone who was well plugged into the world of primary sources, worked in the heart of London, and who entered the fullness of his professional career as a man of letters during the Edwardian era and the late Victorian era. So to him, this is living history, and he very much writes it that way. And that has an enormous, compelling quality to it. Also, the late Victorians and the Edwardians mastered the English prose better than any generation before them, and better than any generation since. So, the Victorians and the Edwardians really was, so far, the high point of the beauty of well-crafted English prose. So, and you get that on every page of this book. But there's also a tiny drawback, which is that he grew ill, and this book on the reign is different from the first volume on the growing up, and the book on the king is different from the book on the Prince of Wales because he didn't write the whole thing. He left it in fragments when he died. He worked hard. He worked really hard to finish it before he died, but he couldn't do it. So it was finished by other hands, talented hands. But you got to know that going in, that this book has 3 drawbacks based on asking the simple question, who wrote it and what was it written for? First drawback is that he wrote it. This was written in the 1920s, the first volume, and also all the parts of this that he wrote were written in the 1920s, shortly after the king had died, when everyone that knew the king was alive. And therefore, there's an element of active discretion that applied then, doesn't apply in the BuzzFeed paparazzi America, the present day, at all. That's gone. But it did apply back then. You have to know that so that you know that if you're looking for a well-studied anecdote of something that seems strange about the king's visit to Morocco, and you're reading that and you're thinking, well, okay, but that doesn't seem real. What really happened? You more than likely won't get the real story in this book, and it won't be because Sidney Lee didn't know it. It will be because he chose for discretion not to tell it. That's number one. Number two is the second drawback is that this is not entirely the work of one author's mind. And that can be a little distracting in terms of what points he wants to make, what inferences he wants to draw, the kind of reading of original sources that he does. He'll do it different from anyone that takes up the pen for him. And the third drawback is that this was published in the 1920s, and our understanding of the past, with any luck, improves as time goes on. So there's a strong argument, like, for instance, when it comes to Edward VII, again, if you're a completist, not necessarily on Edward VII, but on any historical subject that you like, I strongly advise this, but because it's a ton of fun, and I'd be happy to help you. But when it comes to the king, many of his diplomats, his statesmen, all of his prime ministers, left enormous written records of their own in book form. So you can go and find them and read actually contemporaneous things. This is the next step beyond that. This is, 10 years later. But that's still not long enough to know, to keep things really in perspective. What the true meaning of what the king was doing. When you're reading about a historical figure like this, you might want this for the color and the atmosphere and whatnot and the beautiful prose, but you're going to want to know, well, okay, but what is the verdict of history since then, in the generation, a century since then? So you've got those things to consider with that, and then we move on to two later books. The first one is something we've seen on this channel before. This is King Edward VII by Philip Magnus. Now, Philip Magnus is a pen name for an English baronet, part of the nobility. So very much plugged into Edward's world, but not Edward's time. He was born during the Edwardian era and grew up in a completely different era. So he doesn't have that penumbra of discretion. That's gone by the time you get to this book, which I think was written, when was this written? The 1950s? Or the 1960s? 1964. By the time you get to this, the author is no longer doing any silent favors for anyone. And this author is also a fantastic prose stylist. So you've got something like this that purports to be just the same thing as Sir Sidney Lee's two books, which is a soup to nuts full biography of the king. And is really, really good. It's fantastic. It was in all the book clubs. It got all the acclaim in the world when it came out, and its judgments have stood the test of time. So, which is why I wholeheartedly recommended it when I showed it to you the last time. But another book that came out roughly at the same time, also in the 1960s, goes at another question, which was that first question: who's it written for? The audience for Sir Sidney Lee and for Philip Magnus is the general interested reader. That's who it's written for. And this is Uncle of Europe. This is by Gordon Brooke Shepherd, and he was a sharp as a tack old Fleet Street journalist and hack, who is, when you can tell from the title, and you can tell from the subtitle is The Social and Diplomatic Life of Edward VII. And that harks back, you can tell from that title right away that the author is going to hark back to what I was talking about, which is not the endless love affairs, or alleged love affairs, not the gambling scandals, and also not the pre-kingship, not the Prince of Wales. This is, you can tell from the title and the subtitle of this book that Brooke Shepherd is going to concentrate on the things I was talking about. Edward's back-channel diplomacy, his role in the Entente Cordiale, his role in both exacerbating and also restraining what was obviously the growing madness of his nephew, the Kaiser. Those sorts of things. That's the sort of thing that this author is going to dig into. So when you look at this book, that if that aspect of Edward's reign doesn't interest you, this probably isn't for you. No matter how well it's written, it turns out that it's fairly well written. You can always count on those old Fleet Street journalists to know a good turn of phrase, but you can judge it that way. You can judge whether or not it's for your purposes by the fact that it's announcing who it's written for, and then on the subject of what it's written with. That's another thing when you're reading a biography, when you're considering many biographies of one historical person. That's another thing you want to consider. What kinds of sources is the author using? And how extensively are they using it? Because that's going to determine how serious the book is. I think I mentioned in part one of this inadvertent two-part book series that the disgraced British World War II historian David Irving used to have a funny bit that he would do at speeches where he would say that in the typical Hitler biography or World War II history, an author will go into his library, pull down 11 books by 11 other people, and write the 12th book. And that's largely worthless, except for a showcase of the writer's rhetorical ability. And he kind of sort of had a point. If you're dealing with something complex, something that is open to different kinds of interpretation, you really want an author who has done the work. You want someone who has gone to the primary sources. So if, for instance, you were reading, like, for instance, well, speak of the Kaiser, a few years ago, there was a gigantic multi-volume biography of the Kaiser, each one like 1,000 pages long, taking him through the whole stages of his life. And if you had seen those volumes and wondered if they were worth your time, and then looked at the bibliography and saw that the author consulted no German sources, then you would know that the author might be industrious and might have a whopping good tale to tell, but the author is not writing a serious book, not a serious work of biography. He's not even looking at the primary sources. You don't know whether or not an author whose word you're taking for something got it right. You don't know that at all. And you don't know what they missed. You will only know that if you go to the archives yourself. And that's a thing to consider when you're looking at books like this. But also, in addition to whether or not the author did all the legwork, there's also the question of whether or not the author could have done the legwork. Sometimes, well, nowadays when you pick up a new biography of some historical figure, the publicity material will always say that the author consulted previously unconsulted sources. That's usually not true, but every once in a while it is true. And when it is, then you have a whole new ball game to think about. Like, for instance, just recently there was a big tranche of Napoleonic letters that was made public, just translated and made public and annotated and made available to researchers. And it sparked a slew of Napoleon biographies who said, now with new material. But if you looked at those letters, you realize they're fairly trivial. They certainly don't bear on anything important in Napoleon's life. So if you pick up a new biography of Napoleon that cites the publication of those letters as its main reason for existence, you can safely ignore it. Whereas, like, for instance, Rainer Stock, the great biography of Kafka, he was waiting for key records of Kafka's youth to become available, which is why when he did a 3-volume biography of Kafka, he ended with Kafka's youth. Because all the other periods of Kafka's life, we had as much documentation as we're likely to get. But he knew perfectly well, he knew what everyone in the research world knew, which is that there was a gigantic body of material that was being sat on, almost literally, under a bed, so that he was just waiting for court proceedings to make that open to researchers. So he waited. And I myself don't think that what eventually came to light was all that great, but he certainly made gold out of what he found. And that's something you have to take into consideration. When an author is writing a big biography of, I don't know, well, let's use Nathaniel Hawthorne. No important primary sources are likely to come to light about Nathaniel Hawthorne. He was famous for his whole life. Everybody was collecting things on him while he was alive and ever since. So it's unlikely that we're going to find a novel manuscript or a big box of letters. But if something like that did come up that was truly important, well, the first few serious biographies that took advantage of that would be more worthwhile than the ones that came before, because the ones that came before didn't have that material. And believe it or not, that's actually the case with Edward VII. You wouldn't think so in the 20th century. But for years and years, these people, Sidney Lee and journalists and baronets and everything, people who'd been pouring through the archives of at Windsor and at Kensington and whatnot for all the original documents pertaining to Edward's reign. For years and years, those people were bemoaning the fact that Francis Knowles was one of Edward's closest assistants, was with him literally night and day, heard everything that he said, was part of every decision, was in every room, was on every travel, right to the end, to the deathbed. Those people, those earlier biographers, knew that Francis Knowles kept an extensive body of records, and that he destroyed them so that future generations couldn't read them, as body servants will tend to do. Only decades and decades later, it turned out that he didn't destroy all the copies, that the Knowles papers actually did exist. And it came into the possession of Sir Hallam Nicholson, and through Nicholson into the possession of his son, Giles St. Aubin. who wrote a biography of the king using the Knowles papers that no one else had access to, and again was able to draw gold from all of these firsthand impressions. Now, if you're reading biographies on Edward VII, I'm not saying that the Knowles papers invalidates the earlier ones, but you want to know that. You want to know that this author had access to a vital and absolutely essential primary source that no earlier author had access to. And you want to weigh that as to whether or not it's important to you. That will pertain to one of the questions we talked about, which is, who is this written for? If you are a really serious reader of biographies of Edward VII, that's going to make a big difference to you. But then when it comes to Edward VII, because it's a big pleasure-loving king who had lots of love affairs, there are going to be a lot of books that aren't serious, and it might still have an audience, but it'll be a question of whether or not, an open question, whether or not that audience is you. And I wanted to show you some of those, because Edward has certainly inspired his share of them. Like, for instance, Jane Redley's book, Birdie, A Life of Edward VII. You can tell right away there's the king as a young playboy in a top hat, and the title is his family nickname. An impossible act of presumption for anyone in his adult life who wasn't part of his family to call him that, even in private. It would have meant all doors would have been locked to you from then on. So this, for all its spirited writing, is gossip mongering, and it announces that in the first word of its title. So you know perfectly well that Jane Ridley is not going to do an extensive amount of primary research, because why should she? Why does she need to? She can relay all the gossip easily without bothering to do that and have a fairly good selling book on her hands. But most of the gossip when it comes to Edward is largely overblown by time. If Edward so much as brushed his hand on a woman's knee at the opera and never saw her again in his life, she will find her way into a list of his mistresses in a book like this. Same thing with gets us back to the subject of who wrote the book. In this case, it's a biographer who's fantastic. He wrote one of the greatest biographies of Edward's mother. This is Stanley Weintraub. But look at the book. Edward the Caresser, which is the name that Edward had in his own day, a pun on Edward the Confessor. He's been mocked with it ever since, but it announces the fact that Stanley Weintraub is not going to write a particularly serious book. Now, it turns out this book is about the youth. It's the same subject matter as the first volume of Sir Sidney Lee's book, and it turns out that it is really good, which leads me to think that maybe the title was a suggestion of Weintraub's publisher. But even so, there's a strong emphasis on stuff that is trivial. Even with such a great biographer, maybe he was tired after writing a 1,000-page biography of Queen Victoria. I don't know. And then there's something from that I'm not even sure it's out yet in this country. It's this year. It's Catherine Arnold. It's called Edward VII, but the subtitle is The Prince of Wales and the Women He Loved. So right there you see the problem. Which is it about? Is it about the Prince of Wales or is it about the king? And if it's about the king, is that what you're going to talk about? That's how you're going to waste your 300 pages? You're going to talk about the king's dalliances? When he did a lot of other things, when we know that he did a lot of other things, that he was involved in politics and diplomacy, that he was involved in the social life of his kingdom, that he was involved in the workings of his government, that's what you're going to concentrate on? The women that he loved. A book like that announces its intention ahead of time, and then it's up to you to decide what you want. Because with biography, as opposed to, for instance, the latest novel, you're going to have a lot of choices, unless it's a biography of someone who's had almost no serious work done on him, and that happens all the time. Thank God. there have been half a dozen just in 2017 so far alone. Groundbreaking biographies of figures where no one's done serious work before. Gene Kelly, Charlton Heston, people that's fantastic. And with those books, unless you're a completist, unless you've been studying clippings for your whole life, unless you're obsessed, you're going to be learning about that person for the first time, and you'll just go forward from there. So that 20 years from now, if somebody writes another biography of Gene Kelly, well, you'll be able to say, I read the first full, serious biography of him. I wonder how this one compares. But when it comes to an established historical figure, where a huge amount of work has been done, you Unlike with fiction, where you get a novel, you know nothing at all about it unless you study the author, unless you know the author's work, in which case you can go into it a little bit prepared. But I'm the first one to admit that fiction plays by its own rules. And an author who's done terrible work for 10 books can still write a great book. I've seen that happen, and I love it when that happens. But when it comes to biography, when it comes to nonfiction, you're playing in a slightly different part of the pool, and there you have a little bit of questioning of yourself to do, and those are the questions to ask. Who is this book written for? If it's 100 pages long and it's all about Edward the Playboy, Edward the Caresser, and you want a serious book about the king, it's not for you. Who is it written by? Well, is it written by someone who has studied the king for 10 years? 20 years? It's written by someone who's got access to the best private libraries, or maybe who in Sir Sidney Lee's case had access to people that he could talk to, who were witnesses to key events. That you're going to want to ask yourself that question. What is it written with? You're going to want to ask, okay, well, here's a big book. Did this person have access to primary materials? Did they use it? Did they have access to all the primary materials that we have? Did they use them? For instance, if it's an authorized biography versus an unauthorized biography, if you're writing a big biography of John Updike or Saul Bellow, well, there it matters whether or not the family cooperates. Because a book that has, that makes use of 100 taped hours of Updike's mother talking about him is more valuable than one that doesn't. Unless, and then there's the fourth question, how is the book written? Unless the writer just knocks it out of the park, in which case it doesn't matter. Like, for instance, I always use this as my go-to example, Stacy Schiff's biography of Cleopatra. Stacy Schiff is not an Oxford-trained classical scholar. She wasn't tracing pseudepigrapha and rubbing monuments out there in the Sinai Peninsula. And it turned out she didn't need to. She took all the primary sources that we have for Cleopatra. She took a lot of epigraphy, a lot of coins and documents and monuments and whatnot, and every single earlier book that she could get her hands on, and brought to the table the one X factor, which is an incredible writing ability, and wrote a biography of Cleopatra that no one can miss. So there you go. So you want to take all of those questions into account when you try to decide, Ben Sanders style, whether or not a biography is good. So it's a different set of factors than the ones that he was talking about for fiction. But I wanted to introduce some of them for nonfiction because I sometimes feel like I'm one of the only voices for nonfiction on BookTube. But anyway, there you go. That's a hideously long video just on part 2 of the question. So I'll stop for now, and I'll see you soon, BookTube. Thank you for your patience.